All right, everyone. Hello. My name is Quan Tran, and I am a senior lecturer. I'm a senior lecturer in the Ethnicity, Race, and Migration program here at Yale University. Welcome all to this very special event, very exciting, entitled An Evening with Viet Thanh Nguyen, a man of two faces. It's my honor to introduce our speaker, the internationally acclaimed writer and professor Viet Thanh Nguyen. It's also my privilege to moderate the conversation after Viet's talk, and we welcome audience questions. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the lands of the Quinnipiac, the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, the Schaghticoke, the Golden Hill Pecosset, the Niantic, and other Algonquin peoples and nations who stored the lands, animals, plants, and waterways through generations and time immemorial. We honor their stories, their enduring presence, and encourage all to learn more about and support Indigenous peoples' efforts to reclaim sovereignty and stewardship of their lands and their communities, both locally here in Connecticut and elsewhere beyond. We further want to recognize that this country, also this university, is built by the labor of many enslaved people who had been kidnapped from the continent of Africa. We honor them and their survivors' continued contributions and achievements. This country and this university also benefit from the labor and sacrifices of immigrants and migrants of all backgrounds, including those who are refugees, asylum seekers, and the undocumented. It is our collective responsibility to learn about and confront these difficult histories, to repair harm, to sustain this land, and to protect its most vulnerable inhabitants. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Yale MacMillan Center, the Council on Southeast Asia Studies, the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, and the Asian American Cultural Center. It is now my pleasure to introduce Viet Thanh Nguyen, a multifaceted person, so actually more than two faces, with many, many talents. Viet is a prolific and award-winning writer and a professor of English, American Studies and Ethnicity, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. His debut novel, The Sympathizer, is a New York Times bestseller. It won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for fiction, among many other national and international accolades. It has also been translated into more than 20 languages and has sold over 1 million copies worldwide. The Sympathizer was adapted into a great HBO TV series recently. Viet's other significant works include Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, The Refugees, The Committed, and A Man with Two Faces, a memoir, a history, and a memorial. He also edited and co-edited several anthologies, including The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives, the Library of America volume on Maxine Hong Kingston, Trans-Pacific Studies, Framing an Emerging Field, and The Cleaving, Vietnamese Writers in the Diaspora. Viet's newest book, a collection of critical essays published this month by Harvard University Press, is called To Save and to Destroy, Writing as Other. I should also add here that both of Nothing Ever Dies and The Displaced have been anchoring and illuminating texts in my Remembering the Vietnam War and my Intro to Critical Refugee Studies seminars this semester. And Viet has been our intellectual companion throughout these long 12, 13 weeks of grappling with these very urgent issues. In addition to enlightening the different adult reading publics, Viet also delights the younger audiences with his children's books. He co-authored Chicken of the Sea with his then 6-year-old son, Ellison, and his second children's book, Simone, is named after his daughter. On top of this breathtaking range of books, Viet's incisive and thought-provoking essays on a wide range of topics have appeared in The Tale, The Literary Hub, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and Time Magazine, among other journalist and literary platforms. His brilliance has earned him prestigious awards and fellowships from the Guggenheim and the MacArthur Foundations. And in his spare time, Viet also co-hosts the rich and excellent podcast, Accented, Dialogues in the Diaspora, while he also generously mentors many students, graduate students, junior colleagues, as well as writers through his roles both as a professor and as co-founder of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, DVAN. So all this is to say that Viet's contribution and interventions have been phenomenal and wide-reaching. He has earned his place as one of the most important voices of our time. So please join me in welcome Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Wow. Thanks so much for that very generous introduction, Quan, and good afternoon, Yale University. Such a pleasure to be here at a university that rejected me when I applied for college. I always like visiting these kinds of universities because it's a very long list of such places. I was rejected from every single university I applied to, except for one. And that was because I was a very mediocre student when I was in high school. The only thing I was good at was reading. It was the one luxury that I had growing up in a Vietnamese refugee household with parents who ran the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, California, where they worked 12 to 14-hour days almost every day of the year except Christmas and Easter. And so my poor, suffering parents, for all of their sacrifice, all they ever wanted was a doctor. They had no idea that they were raising one of the most dangerous creatures you can find in your household, a writer. I had these ambitions to be a writer from a very young age, and when I was in the third grade, my teacher invited all of us in class to write and draw our book. So my book was Lester the Cat. Lester was an urban cat, stricken with ennui. Bored with city life, he ran off to the countryside. There, in a hay-strewn barn, he found love with a country cat. Now, to my great surprise, the San Jose Public Library gave Lester the Cat a book award and set me on the path to more than 30 years of misery in trying to become a writer. I don't have any complaints about that. That path eventually led me to writing a book called The Sympathizer, which, for better and for worse, is undoubtedly the book that I'm best known for. It is a book that is often referred to as a Vietnam War novel. It is a Vietnam War novel, but it's also a lot more than that. But it's hard to put that in a sales pitch that this is a novel that is also an anti-imperial, anti-colonial critique of the American Empire and America's history of perpetual war. That does not sell well. Vietnam War novel sells pretty well. Now we are 8 days away from the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, and I am sick and tired of talking about it. Nevertheless, in fact, I just did an interview with PBS right before now to talk about this anniversary, and I've been invited to write an op-ed for the LA Times about how the Trump administration has apparently ordered its diplomats in Vietnam not to participate in 50th anniversary commemorations. So this is still a live issue, and of course it's important to remember it. It's important to remember it for everybody who survived that experience and for everybody who did not survive that experience, from Laotians to Hmong to Cambodians to Americans to Vietnamese to South Koreans and to the many other nationalities who participated in this war. I think it's also important to remember this war from an American context, because apparently the United States has learned all the wrong lessons from the Vietnam War. For decades, of course, you could argue that the United States did remember this as a bad war. You could turn to Hollywood's war movies as an example of that. I teach a class on the Vietnam War to 150 undergraduates, almost all of whom are born after 9/11, and almost all of whom have never seen a movie about the Vietnam War. So even that cultural memory of the war as a bad war is vanishing, and instead we're left with the geopolitical realities of what the United States as a military-industrial complex has done with the Vietnam War. The lessons I think we should have learned as a country of the United States from this war is do not interfere with wars of independence and liberation. Do not sponsor or commit genocide. Do not get involved in ground wars where you don't belong. And in fact, we've broken every single one of those lessons in the years since the end of the Vietnam War. As a Vietnamese American, I also have a very personal investment in the way that this war has been commemorated by Vietnamese Americans. And I cannot help but feel great discomfort with the way that the mainstream of the Vietnamese American community has remembered this war as Black April. Of course, the Vietnamese American community has the right to remember the war any way they wish, but the idea of Black April, which I reject, continues to center on this idea of the victimization of the Vietnamese diaspora and Vietnamese refugees. And I can't help but think that there's a direct line between self-centering our victimization as Vietnamese refugees with the fact that the South Vietnamese flag was waved at the January 6th insurrection. How did we go from Black April and drawing attention to our Vietnamese refugee status to participating in authoritarian nationalism? For me, I think the line is actually very clear. When I look at the Vietnamese refugee community and its mainstream, I see a community that is still bound by the trauma of its war experience and its exilic experience. And in that sense, it's not too different than many other Americans who are also bound by that trauma as well. And even those of us who refuse to participate in the narrative of Black April are still bound by that trauma, because that trauma not only defines us whether we like it or not, that trauma also gives us the opportunity to speak in the United States because of that trauma. That's why The Sympathizer was marketable as a Vietnam War novel, even though it was much more than that. I like to quote from the poet Bao Phi, Vietnamese American, who wrote a book called Song I Sing. And in that book, he talks about how he wanted to connect the experiences of Vietnamese refugees from the Vietnam War with the fact that many of those refugees settled in Louisiana and were then turned into refugees again after Hurricane Katrina. And in Song I Sing, in one of his poems, he recounts how when he tried to talk about this, and here I'm going to directly quote Bao Phi, the audience response was, "Shut the fuck up. You get the one trauma, Vietnam. You don't get to connect it to any other trauma." And that's, I think, what we're bound by when we consider a particular history of the Vietnam War in which we, as Vietnamese people or as Americans, are bound as refugees. So Bao Phi, if you ever met him, very lovable man, also very angry poet. And I'm inspired by Bao Phi because I hope that I will one day be lovable, but I know that I'm an angry Asian man. My 30-year journey of writing has been crucial to my humanity, has been crucial to my personhood, because it's through the struggle of writing that I've learned how to fight. Writing is my way of fighting. Writing is my way of mourning. Writing is my way of grieving. Through writing, I have tried to figure out how do we get out of this traumatic bond and bind of our identity? How do we acknowledge the past without continuing to repeat and dwell on our victimization? And in the talk today, I'm going to try to offer a few examples about how that can take place. And I want to begin in a contradictory way with an anecdote that happened to me recently, which is that in the beginning of February, I went to El Salvador. And I arrived in El Salvador on the same day that Marco Rubio arrived in El Salvador. We were both in San Salvador. The rumor I heard was that Marco Rubio was staying at the very fancy Hilton, and I was staying at the slightly less fancy Sheraton. Marco Rubio was there to sign the agreement for the use of El Salvador's prisons to hold what we have been calling deportees from the United States, but which might more accurately be characterized as people who have been renditioned from the United States without due process into El Salvador's prisons. I was there to investigate my connections to El Salvador, which is a connection through the history of massacre. I had come to the United States as a refugee when I was 4 years old, and I was somewhat precocious. I like to read things like the San Jose Mercury News and Newsweek magazine. So when I was about 10 years old, I was reading about the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador, in which US-trained Salvadoran troops came into El Mozote to suppress what they saw as a communist insurgency and proceeded to massacre 1,000 unarmed men, women, and children who were peasants who were not actually even in support of the insurgency. I was reading about the assassination, the murder of Archbishop Romero in 1980, the murder of 6 Jesuit priests in 1980, the rape and murder of 4 American churchwomen in 1980, all carried out by Salvadoran army and military and security personnel trained by the United States. So I was curious about how this history might be impactful for someone like me. Because I had realized that after the United States left Vietnam in 1975, it immediately turned its attention to Central America. I didn't realize that Ronald Reagan had given a speech about this in 1983, so I went and I read that speech recently, a couple of weeks ago. It's an astonishing speech. What's not astonishing is he says, well, we failed in Southeast Asia. For example, we lost Laos to the Pathet Lao, to the communist guerrillas. We're not going to allow that to happen in Nicaragua, in Honduras, and in El Salvador, which is the first line of defense against this new communist invasion in Central America that's now going to threaten what Ronald Reagan described as, I'm going to paraphrase, a greater America. North, Central, and South America, he says, has 600 million Americans who are bound together by Christianity, by capitalism, by anti-communism, and by a will to extract all the untapped resources of this greater America. It's astonishing, the speech that he was giving. And so I saw a direct connection between the history of the Vietnam War and the history of this counterinsurgency effort in Central America, which I regard as an open secret. An open secret. Because this was not something that passed unnoticed in the United States. There were newspaper articles and magazine articles. That's what I was reading when I was 10 and 11 years old. So Americans knew about it, still technically know about it, but it is what I call, in A Man of Two Faces, an open secret. And I'm going to read to you an excerpt from this book about what an open secret is. The open secret dares us to acknowledge its presence. If we tell on the open secret, we anger the many who do not want to call it out. The open secret of America, and every time in A Man of Two Faces I say the word America, it's capitalized and there's a trademark symbol. America, TM. The open secret of America is that white people founded it on colonization, genocide, slavery, war, and white supremacy, all of which continue shaping the self and the other. The open secret of America is that we do not call colonization by its name. Instead, we give colonization another name, the American dream. But, some protest, we do talk about these horrors, especially in books. Yes, but we contain their disturbance through self-representation. And yet self-representation is a euphemism. Open secrets spawn euphemisms, the deadly dialect of the powerful. Open secrets and euphemisms abound. The special military operation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Department of Defense for a United States almost always at war, or the Cold War, a frigid euphemism allowing great powers to distance themselves from the hot wars they fought, instigated, or supported in other countries. The latest battlefield, Ukraine. The American Pentagon press secretary becomes emotional, talking about Vladimir Putin's atrocities in Ukraine. It's difficult to look at some of the images and imagine that any well-thinking, serious, mature leader would do that. I can't talk to his psychology, but I think we can all speak to his depravity, said the press secretary. When was the last time an American official was teary discussing the hundreds of thousands of civilians killed by American weaponry and sanctions, or by the warlords and strongmen we support? In Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American, he has his idealistic and innocent CIA agent, Alden Pyle, who has just sponsored a bombing in Saigon that has killed Vietnamese civilians. He has Alden Pyle say, "It was a pity, but you can't always hit your target. Anyway, they died in the right cause. In a way, you could say they died for democracy." For Americans, the open secret is our own depravity, which must be passed over in silence. To learn a little of these open secrets and hot wars, readers can turn to writers like me, born elsewhere and rebirthed in America, as literary proxies for the less powerful, ethnic representatives in the so-called culture wars over the nation's past, present, and future. As the novelist Rabi Alameddine, also an American among other identities, says, those of us who fall outside the dominant culture are allowed to speak as the other, and more importantly, for the other. I get Lebanon, says Rabi Alameddine. My assignment, Vietnam. The euphemism of self-representation is that we proxies usually do not get assigned America itself. Too big of a subject for our little selves. No. America belongs to the great white American male novelists. For those of you who object to me using that term, let me just say I've been called a Vietnamese American novelist many times. I don't object to that. However, if I'm called a Vietnamese American novelist, then you should call all the white male American novelists white male American novelists. Adjectives for all or adjectives for none. They write from and about the bright center of empire without ever calling it as such, while we write from the shadows and far reaches. Our power comes from witnessing death and suffering, or witnessing the trauma endured by our parents. We are called on to offer testimony about this pain, but we are not the prosecutors, defenders, and magistrates who make the case, write the definitive opinion, hand down judgment. We are expected to show our grief, not to tell on why this grief exists. So, in this talk today, I'm going to try to give you 4 ways of coping with grief that goes beyond victimization, that goes beyond being bound by a trauma that has been imposed upon us. These 4 ways are to abolish the conditions of voicelessness, to commit to expansive solidarity, to embrace capacious grief, and for those of us who are writers, to engage in a practice of showing and telling. So first, abolishing the conditions of voicelessness. When The Sympathizer came out, the first major review of that novel in the New York Times book review, and it was on the front cover, it was awesome. Second line, I believe, the reviewer said, "Viet is a voice for the voiceless." And I was like, no! Have you ever met any Vietnamese people? Been to a Vietnamese house? Eaten at a Vietnamese restaurant? We're really, really loud. And I like to quote Arundhati Roy in this regard when she said, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. So how do we respond to that? For me, the issue has always been to not simply aspire to be a voice for the voiceless or to be an individual writer, even though it's absolutely crucial to acknowledge that for all of us, in the end, writing is a solitary act. For me, what's also been crucial is to build communities and movements. Even when I was the age of some of you in this classroom and I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, I looked around and I realized there aren't enough Vietnamese American voices out there. And I didn't want to be the only one. And so my friends and I, we started at Berkeley Vietnamese American student publications. And then we expanded, and then we started Ink and Blood, a community organization, Muk Ba Mao, highly melodramatic Vietnamese name that I felt was perfect for our melodramatic Vietnamese soul. But this was one of the first Vietnamese American arts organizations in the country, started by people in their 20s and early 30s. And that eventually became the 501c3 nonprofit Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. Not quite an exciting of a name, but better for getting grants and fellowships from people. But the point was that we saw this necessity to build communities and movements, and that imperative has always been the case. I wouldn't have been an Asian American writer if there hadn't been a whole Asian American movement that preceded me. Could you imagine being the first Asian American writer in 1896? That was when the first English language book was published by someone who identified as an Asian in the United States. How lonely was that? But because of an Asian American political and social and literary movement over the next century, that created the conditions for someone like me to emerge. And so it's been crucial for the work of DVAN to build that community, and the latest effort out of that is the book that Quan mentioned, The Cleaving, Vietnamese Writers in the Diaspora, published by University of California Press right now, this month. It features writers from the diaspora that include the United States, France, Australia, Canada, even Israel. Did you know that 300 Vietnamese refugees went to Israel in the 1970s and 1980s, and they produced a poet? One poet out of 300 is not a bad ratio. Van Nguyen. The cleaving, that word, we got that from the poem The Cleaving by Li Young Lee, in which he uses the figure of the butcher, the Chinese butcher in Chinatown, who uses his butcher knife to cleave a duck in two. The cleaving is a separation, but the cleaving is also a bringing together. And that idea that Li Young Lee runs with is beautiful. It's the dialectic of who we are as immigrants and refugees in the United States. So many of us are here in this country because of the violence of the cleaving of war and genocide that turned us into refugees and immigrants, that brought us to this country, oftentimes the country that did the cleaving itself. And yet here we are in the United States, cleaving to the United States as Americans in an act of necessary belonging. But that act of necessary belonging is a complicated one. Me, as a refugee in the United States, I have to ask myself, what does it mean to be a refugee, to come to a country and become someone who participates in settler colonization? When we came to the United States, we settled in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. First, going through a camp called Fort Indiantown Gap. And I have to say, for 40 years, I never asked the question, why was this place called Fort Indiantown Gap? You can imagine why. In that area of Pennsylvania, by 1700, almost all of the indigenous peoples had been wiped out through illness and through warfare. And in 1700, most of the remaining people were massacred by a white male vigilante gang called the Paxton Boys. And when my family left that camp in 1975 and my parents bought their first house, they bought it in a township called Paxton Township. So we arrived as refugees. We began the process of the American dream, but on land that had been cleared through violence by settler colonization. That's what it means to be a refugee in the United States. That's what it means to have this double-edged nature of cleaving. Faced with that, it's not enough to be voices for the voiceless. It's not enough to aspire to be individual, solitary writers. We have to participate in the abolition of the conditions of voicelessness, which can be achieved partly through this idea of building literary communities and the like, but which cannot be finished in that way. The project of abolition, if we go back, the project of abolition has been the abolition of the structural inequities of genocide, of enslavement, of colonization that have embedded itself into our carceral system, into our warfare system, and on and on and on. So there will never be an abolition of the conditions of voicelessness until there is abolition completely throughout the country. And that's why any literary project that refuses to acknowledge that will, in the end, be a project of diversity, equity, inclusion, representations matter, and that entire project of celebrating individual literary voices, which we have to refuse. Part 2, expansive solidarity. What does that mean? Well, A Man of Two Faces, I published that book on October 5th, 2023. I was on book tour when October 7th happened. On October 18th, I signed a letter along with 750 other writers from around the world calling for a ceasefire. And I thought I would read you a couple of excerpts from this letter, because I think that this letter could have been written today. The deliberate killing of civilians is always an atrocity. It is a violation of international law and an outrage against the sanctity of human life. Neither Israel, the occupying power, nor the armed groups of the people under occupation, the Palestinians, can ever be justified in targeting defenseless people. We can only express our grief and heartbreak for the victims of these most recent tragedies and for their families, both Palestinians and Israelis. Nothing can retrieve what has already been lost. But the unprecedented and indiscriminate violence that is still escalating against the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, with the financial and political support of Western powers, can and must be brought to an end. By cutting off vital electricity, food, and water supplies, by attempting to displace by force over 1 million Palestinians from their homes, with no guarantee of return, and by carrying out continual airstrikes against civilians, including those who are attempting to evacuate, the state of Israel is committing grave crimes against humanity. Its allies, our own governments, are complicit in these crimes. The UN expert Francesca Albanese has warned that Israel's current actions in Gaza constitute a form of ethnic cleansing. The Israeli historian Raz Siegel has described the situation in Gaza as a textbook case of genocide. We call on our governments to demand an immediate ceasefire and the unimpeded admission of humanitarian aid into Gaza. We also demand an end to arms shipments and military funding, supplies that can only exacerbate the humanitarian catastrophe at hand. I went a step further. I published that letter on Instagram, and then I appended my own statement in which I affirmed my continuing commitment to BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And then I quoted one of the Israeli ministers, Yoav Gallant, saying that the Palestinians are human animals. And when I heard human animals, I immediately had a reflexive response, because anybody who has been subjected to colonization knows what that phrase means. That colonization is based on this notion that we will bring humanity to the colonies, but if anybody resists, they become human animals who can be exterminated at will. That has always been the logic and the dynamic of colonization. And so I said at the conclusion of that Instagram post, count me among the human animals. That got me into trouble. So there was cancellations of events and things like that on my part. But the reason I bring this up is because I felt that there was a need to respond at the level of expansive solidarity with Palestinians. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from To Save and to Destroy around that issue, because I was in the middle of giving these lectures at Harvard University as I was on book tour and as October 7th happened. And so after October 7th happened, I felt there was no way I could give another lecture at Harvard without acknowledging what was taking place. And that lecture then became a lecture about the necessity for thinking about Palestine as being a part of Asia. Creating literature, and here I'm talking about Asian American literature, was one of the most important ways we as Asian Americans sought to shake off the Oriental double, defend ourselves, and fight for inclusion. Through literature, we give voice to our rightful place as Americans. However, as American power projected itself globally, Asian American literature, which was so important to me, became a subset of imperial literature. Is this why many of us are now silencing ourselves on the question of Palestine? Because we are part of an imperial United States? I was saved from being an Oriental when I encountered Asian American literature and politics in college. I was shocked to discover I knew nothing of Asian American history and its violence. Renaming myself as an Asian American, I became an activist at age 19, motivated by my tremendous conviction that Asian American literature and politics enabled us to seize control of our own stories from racist narratives that stripped us of humanity and subjected us to the terms of bare life: exclusion, imprisonment, exploitation, death. Our literature rattled the imagination. Our movements shook society, each one clearing the way for the other. As our populations and political power grew, so did our literature from its English language origins in the late 19th century. Imagine our surprise a few years ago when the French newspaper Le Monde wrote on the success of Asian American literature in the early 21st century and used our name, Asiatique Américain, Asian Americans. But if some of us manage to squeeze onto the great bookshelves of the West, perhaps it is because we are not apprehended at the moment as engaging in a hostile takeover. In France, those of Vietnamese descent are treated well, partly due to the perception that we work hard and desire inclusion, but also partly because we are not Algerian, North African, Arab, Muslim, or Black, a situation parallel to the United States, where Asian Americans are who we are, partly because of who we are not, indigenous or Black. In France, as in the United States, the question of solidarity looms for those of Asian descent. By identifying with other Asians of different origins, we practice a solidarity aimed for inclusion. This solidarity was once radical, as people who fought one another during World War II, Chinese and Japanese, for example, came together. While this newfound solidarity is important, if we settle for it and exclude those who still do not seem like us, it becomes limiting. The question is whether we can continually practice an expansive solidarity with others whom our country excludes, subordinates, and targets the most, both inside and outside our borders. If Asian Americans decline expansive solidarity, we signal that we are not going to take over, that we know our place. That is, until we reach some unknown point when there are too many of us, as once upon a time there were also too many Jews in the Ivy League. A great comic novel in the manner of Philip Roth could be written about the plight of Asian Americans at Harvard or similar institutions and how these places embody power. The immigrant themes of aspiration, assimilation, and anxiety are present, the standard dilemmas of the ethnic nouveau riche from an earlier generation of Jewish Americans to their ethnic descendants, Asian Americans. Here as elsewhere, we foreground our success stories, which are inextricable from our sob stories. We are valedictorians, salutatorians, celebrities, influencers, actors, chefs, politicians, writers. We are your doctors, radiologists, internists, optometrists, dentists, pharmacists, nurses. We take your blood pressure, give you injections, empty your bedpans. We look into each and every part of you. We tutor you in math and play your classical music. We kneel at your feet to do your pedicures. We dry clean your clothes. We introduced you to acupuncture and yoga and martial arts. But we have been so successful in these endeavors that we probably no longer teach you yoga or martial arts, since you like to teach them yourselves. We gave you an incredible array of spices, flavors, and dishes without which your lives, diets, and palates would be much blander. We design your microchips and program your code. We become the objects of your fantasies and desires. We smile and reassure you. We serve as your excuses to end affirmative action. We are your friendly competition until we are too much competition. History's already caught up with me. After targeting pro-Palestinian students and Palestinian students, the administration and the universities are now targeting other international students, and the administration is now targeting Chinese students. We are too much competition. The reason I picked up on this idea of expansive solidarity, particularly through Asia and Asian Americans, is that, in fact, for me, becoming an Asian American was an act of expansive solidarity. To come out of an environment where I'd gone to a primarily white high school, to come to Berkeley and become immediately radicalized, and to see that I had affiliations with people who my parents saw no connection with. My parents did not see any connection with Chinese or Japanese or Koreans, but me as a 1.5 generation, that was my moment of expansive solidarity. And now, look what's happened to us. We Asian Americans, we're so successful. We have BTS, we have boba, It's great. I don't deny the importance of all of that, but it's hardly an act of expansive solidarity anymore when being Asian American in the mainstream has become commodified. The expansive solidarity that animated the genesis of Asian Americans still needs to be confronted and renewed with those others who do not seem to be like us, but are in fact like us if we create those conditions of empathy and expansiveness. And I think about how when I wrote my first senior thesis, it was on Graham Greene's The Quiet American, as read through the lens of Edward Said's Orientalism. And Edward Said's Orientalism became a key theoretical and political text for Asian American studies and for the building of an Asian American movement, except that most of the East and Southeast Asians who used Orientalism forgot that it had anything to do with Palestine, with Said as a Palestinian intellectual, with Said's definition of the Orient as not really, in his case, being about East and Southeast Asia, but about being what was then called the Near and East Asia, what we might call West and Southwest Asia. So if we go back to this idea of being Asian American, it was never primarily, first and foremost, a question of identity or culture or what we consumed. It was a question of political praxis and theory. So empathetic solidarity for me is born out of that notion of recognizing that in fact we have built kinship and politics out of pulling together people and populations who do not seem to be alike. So simply acknowledging that Palestine is in Asia is not simply saying because we're all Asians we should be together. It's acknowledging that that premise allows expansiveness and empathy to take place around political conditions. At the same time that I was beginning to learn about expansive solidarity, I was also beginning to confront grief and how to be a writer, and how for me all those things, expansive solidarity, capacious grief, and writing were bound up together. I took my first writing class at Berkeley with the writer Maxine Hong Kingston. I was very lucky. I got into her class of 14 students, creative nonfiction class, and every day I would sit this far away from Maxine Hong Kingston, and every day I would fall asleep. At the end of the semester, she wrote everybody a letter, and in my letter, she said, "You seem to be deeply alienated. You should make use of the university's excellent counseling services." And of course, I thought, nothing's wrong with me. I don't need counseling services. I'm going to become a writer. She was right. She was right. What happened was that I had written an essay for her, a 10-page essay, about my mother going to a psychiatric facility. Very difficult essay for me to write. And then I put that essay away in a box, and I didn't look at it again for 30 years until the pandemic. For those 30 years, I never forgot that my mother had gone to a psychiatric facility. But I remembered that she had gone to that psychiatric facility when I was a young boy, because that's how I felt. So then, in 2021, 2020, I opened up that box, I read that essay, and I realized I'd forgotten almost everything I'd written. And I'd forgotten that my mother had gone to that psychiatric facility when I was 18, and I wrote about it when I was 19, and even as a full-grown adult, my memory still changed my reality. Because I was incapable of grieving. I was incapable of confronting the thing that had hurt me the most. And to be a writer, unfortunately, you have to confront the thing that hurts you the most. You have to be able to acknowledge your grief. And you have to have capacious grief as well. And I couldn't help but make the connection between my own grief, my own inability to remember, and the nation's grief, and the nation's inability to remember. I don't think it's a coincidence that nations themselves are incapable, oftentimes, of confronting the worst things about themselves, the things that terrify them the most, the things that are most contradictory to their own sense of self, as happened to me. And as I was writing about my mother, I was also confronting the fact that, of course, my mother was important to me as an individual. But as I thought about everything my mother had been through, I also thought about how everything she had been through had been experienced by tens of thousands of other Vietnamese women. And that did not make her experience any lesser. That collective nature of what she had gone through, in fact, made her experience even more powerful for me. But the problem was, how could I find out what caused her 3 trips to psychiatric facilities in her life? Was it some individual fault inside of her? Or was it history itself and everything that had done to her, that had damaged her irrevocably? So I'll read you an excerpt from A Man of Two Faces. Ma was born in 1937 as Nguyen Thi Bai, a poor girl in a poor northern Vietnamese village. She dies in 2018 as Linda Kim Nguyen, American citizen, traveler of a life both ordinary and epic. At 17, she married and became a refugee for the first time. At 17, I almost did not graduate from high school because I nearly failed pre-calculus. At 38, a mother of 2 biological sons and 1 adopted daughter, Ma became a refugee for the second time, her sequel starting in an alien country. At 38, I, with no children, struggled with writing a short story about Ma. Ma's first name is Bai. Giving children numbers as names was common in rural Vietnam. Families often had so many children, some would not survive. Why give a girl a real name? As a girl, the 7th child, she deserved no more. Ma hated this birth name. In her last decades, she wanted to be called by her American name, Linda. But both her names feel alien on my tongue. I never called her by her name, only Ma as a child, Ma as an adult. Her refugee path shaped even what I called her. Northerners say Ma, Southerners say Ma, and I, as always, am somewhere in between. Most Americans who met Ma probably only saw her mortal, unextraordinary coil. If they knew anything about her, they might know she had been a shopkeeper, businesswoman, refugee. If they knew nothing about her, she was another Asian woman who did not speak good English. Ma, or Ma, never wanted to mention how she received only a grade school education. I'm telling on her, and yet she should be told on, even if it is not my secret to tell. Look at what Ma accomplished with just a grade school education, overcoming everything, almost everything, except her mind. Defeated, like so many heroes, not by others, but by herself. A hero, but not a soldier. People like Ma, who will not be remembered by history, are also a part of history, drafted as reluctant players in horrific wars. Unlike soldiers, these civilians, many of them women and children, never get the recognition they deserve. Some endure more terror, see more horror than some soldiers. And the wars of the 20th century, including the ones in Vietnam, killed far more civilians than soldiers. Civilian stories can be war stories too. Perhaps what happened to my mother was simply her body and mind's fate, but history and war took their turns, hammering Ma, unnerving her, breaking her. My mother, child of colonization and war. Me, grandchild of colonization and war. Also the child of Ba Ma who chose each other. For all that Ma was lost to us for so many years, my father's love was not lost to her. She saw this reality from the orbit of her surreality. I know because the last words Ma says on her hospital bed in the family room before she says the Lord's Prayer with my father are for my father, to my father. Em yêu anh. This I would translate, even if the translation is not enough. I love you. After the Lord's Prayer, silence. My brother, the doctor, gives Ma morphine, while my sister-in-law, the doctor, watches. Ma's breathing slows. I lean close to tell Ma, in Vietnamese, that I love her. She lived a good life, a life of hard work and sacrifice, a heroic life, a life that demanded so much strength, devotion, and love. I don't know where Ma found those qualities, but I am the beneficiary. These words, this faith in her, this betrayal of her, are the outcome. Ma's eyes do not open. She gives no sign of hearing. Her breathing finally stops. It is midnight. Her journey on this earth complete. My mother is mine, and my mother is also other to me. My brother makes a phone call. In an hour, a courteous stranger who might be Filipino arrives with a gurney, fills out a form, takes away my mother, leaves the empty hospital bed in the family room, and drives my mother into the night. I remember Ma loved me. Everything else I can forget. It took me a long time to be able to come to the point in my life as a writer and as a person, as a son, where I could write those words. I had to embrace the capacious grief, which is sometimes simply feeling the grief for the person right next to you. Because the other is not simply some person who is far away across a border. Sometimes the other is the person in your family, right next to you. But in coming to be able to feel this capacious grief for my mother and for other Vietnamese people, I also felt that there was a need to feel capacious grief for others. If we dwell only on the grief for those who we imagine are exactly like us, where does that grief lead us? Where does our sense of victimization lead us? Too often it leads us to victimizing others. We have seen this pattern over and over again throughout history and in different countries. And so that's why I felt it was important for today, with this impending anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, not to dwell only on Vietnam and what it's meant to me, but to try to build links and to commit to this expansive solidarity and to this capacious grief. And that's why I went to El Salvador, and I want to end there. I went to El Salvador, I went to El Mozote. I interviewed 3 survivors of El Mozote. 2 of those men who were survivors were my age, which meant when I was 10 years old, reading about El Mozote in Newsweek, these were little boys running away, trying to survive. And all of them lost many people. So I sat there in the central square of El Mozote. It's a 5-hour drive from San Salvador. It's quite a trek, but it's still a tourist area. Yeah, there's a beautiful memorial there. There's a town that's being built. And it's in the shadow of the government. But one of those men invited me to go see his private memorial that he had built on his property right next to his house. And I could not turn that invitation down. So the next day, we drove half an hour into the countryside to see the village of La Jolla, and this is what this passage is about. I want to remember all the ways in which my existence in what I'm calling Greater America connects me with those who also want to remember rather than to forget or distort. So after my visit to the memorial of El Mozote, I accepted the invitation of one of the survivors to visit his home in the outlying village of La Jolla. The victims of the massacre committed there included many of his relatives, and Amadeo Martinez Sanchez wanted me to see his own private memorial. So we drove the next afternoon into the countryside on an unpaved road, following a pickup truck with 24 school children standing in its bed. They were returning home from school in white shirts and blue pants or skirts, hanging onto the welded-on frame around the bed until the pickup paused and let them off by 2s or 3s in front of their homes. After half an hour, we reached a small gray house of stone walls and a tiled roof. A picture of Archbishop Romero hung on the front of the house next to a rack of potato chips, indicating that inside the house was a convenience store run from a single room, all the goods stacked on a table. Next to the house, behind a chain-link fence, is the memorial that Sanchez has built under a corrugated tin roof. There is a stone wall, and on it are a crucifix with Jesus Christ draped in a loincloth, and 17 black plaques bearing dozens of names of the dead, the remains of 40 of whom are buried beneath the memorial. Sanchez tells me of how 24 of his relatives had been killed, pointing to their names. Among them is his mother. I see someone as old as 76, a child of 2, another who is a 0, killed in the womb. I do not know what to say to Amadeo Martinez Sanchez, so I tell him of the Vietnamese saying that we utter when confronted with another's grief. I tell him that we like to chia buồn, to share sorrow. My translator translates. Sanchez nods. We are quiet, and then I give Sanchez all the American dollars I have on me as a donation to his memorial. Sharing sorrow is not enough, but it is a beginning, as well as an obligation for all those Americans who would like to believe that there is something great in America, a greatness that would allow us to unite America rather than to divide and conquer it. That greatness would be based on grief rather than profit, on sharing sorrow rather than monopolizing power. I think of how there are not enough memorials in the world, of how many massacres have no markers to commemorate them, no survivors to remember the dead, all amounting to an untold history of massacre. Sanchez is one of the lonely keepers of these memories of massacre, of whom there are many scattered throughout Greater America. For those Americans of the United States who would like to save their country, I would suggest that we listen to the stories of Sanchez and those like him. Their reminder of the inhumanity done in our name forces us to prove our humanity rather than to assume that our humanity already exists. They are the witnesses to the worst of us, and for their existence and persistence, we should be grateful. Thank you. In all my excitement, I forgot to say that that last section was the show and tell section. I need the water, thank you. Thanks.
Wow, Viet, thank you so very much. I think the arc of the narrative that you have shared with us have taken us both expansively across space and time, right, but also deeply into the intimate processes of thinking about how do we relate to others and how do others relate to us. So I wanted to start out with just asking this pretty broad question, and you can kind of take it how you want to, because it is something that's been on my mind. I think for many of us who are in this contemporary moment, in a moment in which our nation is at a historical juncture, and that juncture is continuing to expand and is going to go the way that it will go, it occurs to me that this is also a moment in which, for many of us who have experienced displacement, who have spoken to people who have experienced displacement, we recognize that this is actually a moment in which we are refugees in the making, right? So for those of us who've been through it, the writing's kind of already on the wall. But for those of us who may not be as familiar, because our existence and our protection from knowing this feeling has been a privilege of our birth in this particular country. So my question to you is, how do you navigate this moment as an individual who recognizes perhaps these signs, but also as a writer, which I think you've done a lot more and shared with us, but also as a parent, right? You mentioned in your talk that your mother is a child of colonization and war. You are the grandchild of colonization and war. You have little ones. How do you think about this moment in relationship to those relationships that you are carrying through this moment?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I have to point out that my parents were actually refugees twice. They were refugees in 1954 from the north to the south, and then again in 1975. So their personal history, and I don't want to aggrandize it because, as I've mentioned, their personal history is not any different than hundreds of thousands of other Vietnamese people who've survived the same things. But their history, I think, conditioned them to be ready to move and to make literally life and death decisions for themselves and also for their families, and to bear the costs of that. Part of the cost of that is that in 1975, when we left, my mother brought my brother and I along as we left our hometown. My father was in Saigon, and we left behind my sister. And I was 4 years of age, and of course I knew I had a sister when I was 4, but then I forgot I had a sister. And lo and behold, when I was 11 or 12, this letter shows up in San Jose with a picture of this beautiful young woman. And I was like, "Who's this?" And my parents said, "That's your sister." I was like, "What? What happened?" And so I take this history of warfare and flight and the refugee experience and the fracturing of families and the burdens that parents bear very seriously, And on the one hand, I'm deeply committed to the United States because I live here, I'm a citizen here. There's a whole history of struggle that I've alluded to and which has shaped me. And yet I'm also the parent of 2 children, and I have to be prepared for the worst. So I have contingency plans. And I think everybody who's been a refugee probably has a contingency plan or has imagined what the contingency plan is. I've talked about it with my wife. If this happens, we're going to do this, and so on. So there are hopefully enough signals that we would have in advance before anything truly terrible happens. But who knows what's going to take place. So on the one hand, I think we have to prepare for contingency plans. On the other hand, I identify myself with the genealogy of what I consider to be engaged and committed writers who have confronted these situations and worse. So, for example, the closest precedent to what's happening now would be the Vietnam War and the unrest that happened and the student protests and the political repression and what I've called America's Civil War in the soul. And there's a direct connection between all of that and the contemporary situation. The current Trump administration attempts to crush student dissent, directly connected to that. The culture wars directly connected to the ruptures of the Vietnam War for the United States, and on and on and on. And yet when you look back, people were being killed. We haven't gotten to this point yet, where students were being shot to death. Other people were being killed, obviously. Violence was on the streets. Assassinations were happening. Angela Davis was being put on trial. Many, many different things have happened then that have not yet quite taken place for some people. And so when I think about it in historical perspective, it does give context that there is still worse that could happen. There's still room to fight, and that we must fight. And especially those of us, I'm a writer, and so I'm going to talk to writers. for those of us who are writers, writing is fighting. Writing is many things, as I tried to allude to. Writing is art, writing is mourning, writing is grieving, writing is loving, writing is also fighting as well. All those things have to happen. And so we each identify our own genealogies, what we believe in, who we look to as our predecessors, and those writers who have fought have been my predecessors.
And I think you also are passing that on to your children, right? As a kind of an inheritance. As a writing as a form of self-expression, but also as a kind of resistance that continue to carry on in a way that I think your mother was not a writer, your father was not a writer, but they are passing a form of expressive thoughts, right, in naming and experiencing the various conditions that they've gone through. What's really interesting about your talk is you talk about the kind of temporalities, the kind of delayed recognition of certain moments in your life, right? So I was very touched when you recall your letter, your essay that you've written about your mom and kind of tucking it away and forgotten about it and kind of digging it up again in another time of crisis, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. For me, these are kind of archival acts that we do both deliberately and non-deliberately, right? So if you were thinking in this moment where we are now, what were some of the things that you might want to archive to ensure, right? I think in your book, Nothing Ever Dies, you invoke, you introduce to us and you offer us this notion of both just memory and just forgetting. So as we are historical actors in this moment, how do we ensure a future in which this kind of calling for just memories and just forgetting of past experiences can help inform our practices for a kind of future remembering or future forgetting?
Wow, that's a great question. Let me just point out on the question of creativity, I try throughout in my writing to not lionize writers. Writers are great at lionizing writers. We're great at praising ourselves. Oh my God, that person was such a genius and they sacrificed and they did this great work of art, et cetera. And yeah, it could be true. But, part of, my own work has been recognizing that my parents were creative people too, as you alluded to at the beginning. All our parents who came as refugees were creative people. They built something in this country with all the complications that I've already also alluded to. I think about the fact that the people who are small business entrepreneurs like my parents, they created something. And when we go and we see Little Saigon, for example, or these other kinds of so-called ethnic communities, they created something. That is their claim to the American public space, again, with all of the complications. So I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that our artists are not the only creative people. Mm-hmm. And it's humbling for me to think that my parents were also creative people in their own ways. And when you create, you don't anticipate, you don't know what's going to happen. Like my parents wanted to create me as a devoutly anti-communist Catholic, and I came out an atheist Marxist. What the hell happened? And I think for me, what happened was because despite their best intentions, despite their explicit intentions, they did actually convey what was important, which was they taught me about Jesus Christ, and my interpretation of Jesus Christ is that he is a refugee and a radical. That's what I got out of my Catholic inheritance. So who knows what my children will get from me. But in terms of like an archive, I think I archive everything. And I think that should be the impulse. You never know what you're going to find. So again, other stuff that I dug up from my archive, I retained my arrest records from my college undergraduate days. I like to say that I graduated from Berkeley with 2 majors, 3 degrees, and 4 misdemeanors, and I have that on paper. So you don't know exactly what will be relevant to you. And though those little scraps of paper that you never could have imagined might be useful, in fact, bear traces of things that could be enormously significant to you so much later on. So for example, something that I really should burn these documents, but I kept a diary when I was in high school and college, and it's a terrible diary. You're supposed to write in your diary every day. I wrote like once every 2 or 3 months or whatever. So it's a terrible diary because it only gives the worst of me, and I have it, but it includes some of these things that I mentioned in A Man of Two Faces, as I wrote about my mother and my father, things that I'd completely forgotten about. So for example, my mother would say, "You are so wasteful. You're such an ungrateful son. Your father doesn't buy new shirts. He wears your hand-me-down shirts." When I read that again, I was like, "Oh my God, that's how they got me." But it's a testimony to what I had forgotten, but what was something that was in the archive that I never thought I would keep. So one day I will burn that, I think. But Yeah. Archives are dangerous, let's say. Archives are very dangerous.
Well, we know that, right? Because archives are also instruments of power in terms of retaining certain kind of narratives or allowing certain kind of narratives to have an afterlife in ways that some of our archives from the smaller people do not get to be preserved in these ways. Now, I want to kind of tie this kind of archival practice or archival meandering to one of your points about expansive solidarity. Because it feels to me that when we are trying or attempting to kind of climb out of our own boxes and circles to reach out and to understand others, we actually need to be able to be fluent in their archives, right? And I think your reminder of Edward Said's Orientalism book is a good reminder. It's because then oftentimes we're boxed in these kinds of self-centered or nationalized spaces of archival that we forget to practice that fluency. So reading as a point of transcending those boundaries is important. But I remember reading in your collection, The Displaced, in which you, brought together a bunch of amazing refugee writers. And in the introduction to that piece, I'm paraphrasing here, and forgive me if I got it wrong, but you talk about literature as a form of activism, right? But the kind of activism that you don't just read and leave. But good literature is the kind of literature that makes you get up and move, right? And so in this conversation, in this moment, about how do we build capacity to be expansive in our solidarity, what are your advice to those of us who are intending to do that, but quite not sure where to begin?
Such a great and difficult question, too. I think about how, on the first point about what literature compels from us. I mean, when you say literature is activism, I agree with that. But literature is also art at the same time. I don't think we're moved to feel and moved to the possibility of action unless the work itself is beautiful in some way. And I want to stress that because I get criticized on a fairly regular basis for people saying he's just a communist, he's just a Marxist, as if these are bad things. And, he wants to bring art and politics together and that Soviet Union kind of stuff and so on. And that's not true. I go back, I never try to legislate what writers do. I don't tell writers do this, do that. I just say, hey, think about this. Think about what it would mean to have your literature engage with worldly matters. But I go back to this notion, and I want to quote, a great white male writer, John Keats, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. And if I believe in that, and if you believe that beauty and truth are related together, then if you find ugliness in the world, injustice as a form of ugliness, you have to speak the truth to that, and you have to render that in the most beautiful way that you possibly can. So the writers who've inspired me to action, both as a writer but also as someone who could be an activist, have always been the writers who have done their best to combine beauty and truth, to tell the truth in the most beautiful way possible. So just, talking about literature as a form of activism might tempt people to think, oh, then, aesthetics doesn't matter. But it's not true. Aesthetics absolutely matters. We read Toni Morrison because she spoke the truth and she spoke it beautifully, both at the same time. And that's the highest level that we should be aiming for. But, that when someone writes a book and you read it, it's an invitation. It's an invitation to feel. It's an invitation to take action. It's up to you whether you take up that invitation or not. And so for me, to use the Palestinian example, I read Edward Said's Orientalism when I was like 19 or 20. I took up part of the invitation to use that to become an academic. I didn't fully take up the entire invitation because I didn't read extensively enough. So part of my training has always been that if I don't know enough, I have to keep on reading. So, for example, in To Save and to Destroy, the lectures that just got published, I did an interview with Ijeoma Oluo a couple of days ago, and she commented about how she enjoyed the fact that To Save and to Destroy includes a lot of references to global Black thought, African-American literature, but also global Black diasporic decolonizing thought as well. And the reason it does is because I've engaged a lot with that those bodies of writing, so that I could internalize some of the insights of Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon and Toni Morrison and Ralph Ellison and W.E.B. Du Bois and so on and so forth. And likewise with Palestinians, I have to admit, I signed the BDS statement in 2015 without, as a matter of principle and belief, but without knowing as much as I should. And then come 2023, I felt like now I've been at fault. I need to do the reading. I need to take up the invitation that had been extended to me a long time ago. And so each of us manifests our action in different ways, whatever our professions and vocations are and how you decide to do that. But as so far as it comes to the act of reading, that is the invitation that exists. There's probably nothing that you need to know that hasn't been written about already. So it's up to us to do that work of reading so that we're better informed and better prepared to engage and to take action.
And I think reading also enable us, right, to empathize, to expand our kind of sense of collective grief, right? That capacious grief, I think is really significant. And I think it's really a marvel to be able to move from the personal to the kind of collective grief. And I think you shared it beautifully in terms of how you talk about the loss of your mom. Also, your lost memories of her, right? But if I may go a little bit personal into this here, A Man of Two Faces is a book that is a memoir, a history, and a memorial. The memoir is you. The memoir is your mom. The history is the kind of U.S. history that you're grappling with, right, and critiquing. But on the face of the cover of the book is a face that is of your dad. And I've learned that you recently lost your dad. So if I may, could you talk a little bit about this particular book and your relationship to it now that your dad has passed, and especially as we're inching closer to the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, which was the moment, right, that your sense of self as a refugee and your family's refugee journey emerged. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I never set out to write a memoir. Never wanted to write a memoir. Looking back on my life, I always thought, it's such an uninteresting life. He's a writer. Who cares about that? The interesting lives were my parents, but those are not my stories to tell. And so that's a territory that every memoirist who deals with their family has to navigate. That oftentimes in writing the memoir, you have to engage in an act of betrayal, tell stories that people don't want to have told. And I've often had people ask me, how do we do that? How do we ethically navigate this terrain? I don't have an answer for you. I had to wait until my mother passed away and until my father's memory had started to slip before I could finally write this book. And I like to say that there's no greater curse I can give to somebody than, I hope you have a life worthy of a memoir. Because if that's the case, then something terrible has happened to you. No one wants to read a memoir about someone who's had a happy life. Screw you. Go live your happy life. We want to read memoirs about people with unhappy lives, or been touched by unhappiness. And so, what was interesting for me to write this memoir was to negotiate the terrain of loyalty and betrayal. That is, in fact, the terrain of the most interesting memoirs, I think. And that extends to both the personal account, but also the historical account. I've been told so many times by people, love it or leave it, when it comes to the things I've said about the United States. And of course, my relationship with Vietnam is kind of fraught with the government as well. And so the loyalty and betrayal issues are not only there within the family and your loved ones when you write a memoir, but if you write about the country or the community, then you're also in that territory of loyalty and betrayal as well. Should you be faithful to your community and your country? But if you tell the truth, are you betraying them as well? Again, a fraught bind that people are caught in. And everybody has to navigate their own way through that. I think one of the better ways, of course, is to acknowledge that problem exists. It's the worst possible thing if you betray somebody and don't acknowledge to your reader that you've betrayed them, right? And so, in A Man of Two Faces, there is explicit acknowledgement that the betrayal has happened here. But the last thing about A Man of Two Faces that I would say is that it was, in some ways, very joyful to write. The first 2/3 was a lot of fun. The last third, writing about my mother, was very, very, very hard to do. And I just think that part of the difficulty in writing a memoir is that you have to betray not just other people, but you have to betray yourself. I think that memoirs shouldn't be easy to write because what you're investigating in the end is yourself. And at least in my experience, investigating myself has been to uncover things that I never wanted to acknowledge about myself. I'll give you one anecdote. So when at the beginning of the book, I talk about how when we came to the United States and we were in this refugee camp, and in order to leave the refugee camp, you had to have an American sponsor you. There was no American willing to sponsor all four of us. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And this is where my memories begin howling and screaming as I'm taken from my parents. And for most of my life, I didn't forget that this happened, but I also thought, that wasn't such a big deal. It's not a big deal compared to people who got shot, who got lost at sea, who were in prison, things like this. So it's not a big deal. And then when my son turned 4 in 2017, this was a year of the Trump administration started to separate families from their children and put them into cages and lose kids and all that kind of stuff. And it's referenced in A Man of Two Faces, but I looked at my 4-year-old son and I saw me at that point. And I thought, wow, what was I feeling when I was 4 years old? What were my parents feeling when they had their children taken away from them? And I realized that, in fact, maybe there was more damage done to me than I had ever dared to admit. And so part of the narrative of this book is for me to realize that, in fact, it was enormously emotionally damaging to be separated from your parents. And my way of survival was to turn myself off emotionally, to go completely numb. And so, there's a moment in the book where my parents were shot in their store on Christmas Eve. I'm like 10. My brother's 16 or 17. He tells me the story over he's taking the phone call. He's told me the story. And he's crying, and I'm watching cartoons, and I'm not reacting at all. And he says, "What's wrong with you?" And that was the question. What is wrong with me? Why am I not able to react? Why am I not able to feel? And so for decades, I always felt that was my problem, as my mother's psychiatric issues were her problem. But in fact, again, how do you separate the history from the emotional damage done to the individual? And I'm not trying to, again, aggrandize my own situation. It's simply that was the personal damage that was done to me. And it took me 4 decades of being a writer to excavate that. Because as my wife will tell you, I'm not socially well-adjusted. When we first started going out, I said, "I'm pretty well-adjusted, right?" She said, "No, you're not." I said, "Who are you going to believe, me or my wife?" Obviously believe my wife. But it took me 4 decades of using my writing to try to interrogate myself in order to finally then be able to understand that even these seemingly minor moments will do enormous damage to people, and that this is the way that history ripples through us, through our emotions.
And so with that, I kind of want to open up and invite the audience to share some thoughts or questions that you may have for Viet. There are microphones going around, about to go around. What did you do with it?
I'm actually pretty good with this.
Yeah, and then we have a one.
I like to call it the Phil Donahue Show, which no one under 30 even knows what that means.
Has one. Okay.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Michelle Kim Gardner, Korean name Kim Mihi. I'm a research fellow in the Department of American Studies here. So you talked a little bit about your origins in San Jose and a lot about the military-industrial complex. So I wanted to ask, how do you place your experiences as a refugee of war, an experience shaped by U.S. militarism, with coming of age in the heart of the newest iteration of the military-industrial complex in Silicon Valley? And one small secondary question, what's better, Southern or Northern style pho?
Wow. Heard that groan. Yeah, Southern pho, of course. I mean, that shouldn't even be asked. Good. I don't hear any opposition to that. Well, I think that this is where I think that on the military-industrial complex question, number one, I do think that for me, the history of the United States has been defined through a history of perpetual war. It's not just the military-industrial complex in the Eisenhower era and onwards, but the very origins of our country is found in warfare. And if you look at our history, we've been at war regularly throughout our history. And oftentimes our wars are not the big spectacular wars like World War II or the Vietnam War, but small wars, right? Or interventions, occupations, whatever, aid missions, whatever you want to call them. So the act of war has been crucial to the shaping of American culture and politics and economics and so on. We are facing something different, I think, in the era of the U.S. as a global hegemon after 1898 and the Philippine-American War, and then the Cold War. So I don't know what the newest iteration is that exactly you're referring to, because after the Vietnam War, then we had 9/11 and the Iraq and Afghanistan, and now we have our support for Israel and what I would consider to be a genocidal attack in Gaza, and that's not even the last of it. So we're living in an age in which I think I don't know how new it is, but we are inside a war machine. And in A Man of Two Faces, I compare that to like just living inside a machine where you get used to the hum of the machinery until you can't even hear it anymore. I go back to this story that Maxine Kingston told in Chinamen about her brother who went to fight in the Vietnam War, and he didn't do anything. He just sat in a Navy ship. But she says he was still complicit, as we all are. She ties this metaphor. You open the door to the refrigerator, you're complicit, because the gas in the refrigerator is made by the same company that makes napalm or something like that. So we are all complicit by paying our taxes, by participating in every other aspect of American life, because no aspect of American life is not connected to the military-industrial complex and the war machine. And so perhaps that is new in the second half of the 20th century.
Thanks for your talk. I'm Lucas. You talked very powerfully about grief in this talk. I'm curious if you think at all about pride in writing and what the relationship is for you between grief and pride.
I try to keep that secret. That's shameful to be. If you're Asian, don't be proud, But the question of pride is interesting because I try not to be too proud in my secret moments. I will be, but in public, no. Because I do think about writing as, very much so. Writing is an individual act I carry out, and I think all writers carry out. In the end, we're alone in our own minds, in our own rooms, doing the writing. But the conditions that create writers are collective. So I wouldn't be a writer if it wasn't for my parents. I wouldn't be a writer if it wasn't for the Saigon Moi, the grocery store that my parents ran, that they sacrificed their lives for, that I disavowed. I would not want to spend my life in the Saigon Moi, but the Saigon Moi made my life possible. And that bind of obligation and guilt and sacrifice is true for so many writers who are willing to acknowledge it. And of course, there are writers who refuse to acknowledge it, and then they are proud of themselves as individual writers. But if I acknowledge the collective conditions of history and community and family and sacrifice that made me possible, I don't see anything to be proud about. I'm proud of my parents. I'm proud of what they went through. I'm not proud of being a writer because it's the least, it doesn't compare to what my parents went through. The thing about pride that I am willing to acknowledge is that my father never read my writing as far as I know. However, he collected every book, and every time I would visit him, he would say, "How many copies have you sold?" And when I told him, he was very happy and very proud, and that I'm willing to acknowledge.
I am thinking about what you said about victimhood, and I'm Trin, I'm a law student, and this semester I've been writing a critique about a victimhood, and in some ways, the 1980 Refugee Act was passed in response to the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis, which is about us. I also moved to the US as a refugee when I was 3, but it also was aligned with this really right-wing, reactionary victims' rights movement that proliferated in the United States in response to the Warren Court's due process revolution. And so in some ways, the Refugee Act is really powerful because it's protected so many people on the basis precisely of victimhood, but also, as we all know, it's been very harmful because then it's almost like who's been persecuted more and whose victimhood is worthy of arbitration such that people have a stake to belong in this country. And so I'm hearing the stories about you going to El Salvador, and there's kind of a tension for me in that, we're bonding with folks over the shared experience of struggle, which in my opinion is sort of still viewed linked to victimhood and persecution. And so what do you see is after victimhood, and how do we start to disentangle this really toxic, harmful frame from our politics so that we can push forward?
I don't choose to know how in this example, Amadeo Sanchez Martinez thinks about all of these kinds of things. I don't know if he would agree with anything that I've said about the politics of the framing of the situation. He may dwell in his own victimhood for all that I know. I think the difference is, for me, I'm talking about capacious grief. I'm talking about what we can feel. I refuse to dwell on my own victimization. I mean, that's, to me, is a limited notion. But I choose to feel capacious grief, not only for myself, my family, the Vietnamese people, but to other communities that I think we share something with. So that's the distinction that I would draw. That yes, people who foreground their victimization may very well end up being bound to it. That would include the people that I talk about. But that doesn't prevent us from feeling grief on their behalf or sharing their sorrow. That's the distinction that I would draw.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I was just remembering you came to speak at the ACC over Zoom. I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago. And I asked you a question about the kind of infamous squid scene in The Sympathizer. And I'm curious about and you gave this response, that war is absurd. And that's why you're interested in using humor in your writing. And I'm curious whether that is still true, given, I don't know, the level of devastation we've seen in Gaza in this genocide, and if you think that all of war is absurd.
I've taught a book called The Pesoptimist by Emil Habibi, which is not it's a novel from several decades ago, that Edward Said thought was one of the great Palestinian novels, and it is a sort of Candide like account of what it's like under these conditions of occupation and apartheid. So yes, I do believe that everything can be treated with humor, and that everything where we see the contradictions between the ideals and the practice of a civilization is absurd. Now the difficulty is finding the humor, finding the distance and the time to be able to do that. For example, I would love to make jokes about what's happening right now in this country. I'm not yet quite able to do it, but that doesn't mean that I don't think jokes can't be made. I think they can. I just haven't found how to do that yet. But it's crucial to be able to do that, because jokes are not simply a way of, yes, they're a way of alleviating things, but jokes are also political. They're also satirical. They're crucial, tools for critique as well as entertainment and alleviation. So no, I do believe that jokes can be made about everything. Whether I am the right person to make jokes is another issue. Am I the right person to make jokes about the Holocaust? Probably not. But I'm the right person to make jokes about the Vietnam War or refugee crises. So jokes are very strategic, jokes are hard to pull off, and obviously jokes are risky to do as well, but jokes are also necessary.
Professor Nguyen, thank you so much for coming to Yale. My name is Will, and I had a brief question. I'm also the political director for the Vietnamese Student Association. So at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about your critique of Black April and the frame of understanding 430. Oftentimes on American campuses, there are two completely different interpretations of 430 by two different Vietnamese student organizations, one by international students and then one by domestic students. Here at Yale, we only have one for both domestic and international students. So the question that I have to ask for you is, when it comes to addressing a lot of domestic students, when we have to grapple with a lot of what we are told as children about how the North is quote unquote evil communists and the trauma that comes from that event, but also reconciling the broader Vietnam War as a broader struggle against American hegemony and against American imperialism, colonialism, violence, etc. How should domestic students approach both these conflicting narratives that we are told at home, but also as we grow older, our own complicity and our own struggle against American hegemony and American imperial violence?
Yeah, great question. So, for example, I was actually inspired because at USC, my own campus, periodically the Vietnamese students invite me to go talk about what they call Black April and so on. And the last couple of times, as you said, the population was both Vietnamese American and Vietnamese international students, and for them, April 30th and all that represented was simply history. They just wanted a historical lecture. They didn't know very much about it. Obviously, they had been told certain things by their parents and by their schools and so on, if they were coming from an international context. But mostly it was just history. And then after I was done with my lecture and they asked a few questions, then it was time for the boba. And then it was actually incredible. I was actually really moved by this because 15 years ago, that discussion could not take place. In fact, we had that discussion at USC because we had a little political incident where one of the Little Saigon activists from Orange County heard that the red flag of Vietnam was flying in our international row of flags, and he came to campus and he stapled the yellow flag on top. So, myself and other faculty brought together these two groups, the Vietnamese American and Vietnamese international students, 15 years ago. And the Vietnamese international students said, we understand your pain, and it's time to move on. And the Vietnamese American students said, we cannot move on because of our parents and our inherited experiences. So what part of what that indicates for me is generations pass. And inevitably, these things will become historical. That will make life easier in some ways. But in the situations where you're describing where there is still the live wire of emotions that happen, there's no singular answer that I can give you. Like for me, my way of coping with these kinds of issues with my parents was not to talk about them with my parents. I was very good at protecting the family harmony and the family peace. Now, did my parents know what I believed in? Like when I gave my father, for example, my first published short story that was translated into Vietnamese, it was about a Vietnamese refugee who comes to San Francisco in 1975 and finds out he's gay. I gave that story to my dad. I know he could read it. It's in Vietnamese. We never talked about it. So in some ways, I mean, the impetus to confront everything fully in the open all the time may not always be the culturally appropriate response. So there's no singular answer that I can give you. Sometimes avoiding the conflict is the way to go. If your family and your environment is conducive to having that confrontation, then you should have that. But otherwise, for you as an individual, the way that you phrase the question is very much like the sympathizer. You have to be able to live with these two conflicting political realities and personal realities at the same time. All these people were involved in this terrible conflict, or they're descendants of those people, and there are two radically divergent interpretations of it. In the way that I phrased it in Sympathizer, it was to, quote Hegel, what makes tragedy is right versus right rather than right versus wrong. But I think it has to be qualified a little bit, because for me, in writing the Sympathizer, it was very much about showing how both sides thought that they were right. But in my mind, it wasn't that, therefore, it's inconclusive and we can't make a conclusion. We do have to make a conclusion. He, the narrator of the Sympathizer, is caught in this Hamlet-like dilemma because he can't make up his mind what to do or what to decide. That's not necessarily my dilemma, not necessarily your dilemma. So you can acknowledge the fact that there's two conflicting political realities. It doesn't mean that somehow then you are caught in not being able to make an assessment about that.
So I'm Vietnamese American, and I'm also an artist. I actually saw you guys when I toured with Ching Ming Ha back in Stanford back in the day. And I know the loneliness that it took to be a voice. However, I always think about what you just mentioned, that your story, you've been writing in this language that is not your own, that's not your birth language, even though you grew up since you were 4, and you're writing in English, and then your story had to be translated in order to connect. How do you reconcile with that? Because you actually are using the power, the tool of, the hedge money.
And that is the dilemma, isn't it? I think I quote Caliban in one of these books, I can't remember, probably in A Man of Two Faces. You have taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse. And that is the dilemma. That is the parable of the person who has been colonized. What language are we supposed to speak in? And whatever method we choose, we're trapped, right? And so there's no right or wrong answer. It's a problem that's born out of the issue of colonization. And so we have to turn our attention to what that means. And so in my work, there's a constant attention paid to language, both explicitly and implicitly. And I think that's important to stress. I mean, explicitly, I acknowledge that, that I've made a difficult choice in writing. And in Man of Two Faces, I talk about this. Is this my mother tongue or my native tongue when I write in English? It's not my mother tongue, because my mother tongue is Vietnamese, but it feels like my native tongue because I grew up in it when I was 4. And that dilemma is important to acknowledge explicitly. But there's another way in which that struggle is implicit, and I think hopefully you'll relate to this as an artist. Not everything is said explicitly. So in writing The Sympathizer, but with every book that I write, I'm always attentive to the question of the language itself. Not the fact that it's in English per se, but what are the rhythms of the language? What is the density of the language? What kind of words am I using? So in The Sympathizer, it's an incredibly dense language for some readers, and the reason why it's an incredibly dense language is because it's supposed to indicate that our protagonist is also struggling with who he is in this context of colonization as well. A Man of Two Faces is written quite differently, more accessible in some ways, but also fragmented, because it's about memory and about how my own access to memory has been fragmented, and there are holes. There are things that I can't remember, right? So every situation compels a different response to language. But that's true not just for writers and for artists, but for all of us. I think we're always making strategic and tactical choices about the language that we're using based on the environments that we find ourselves in. But I take hope in the end in this one comment that was made to me by this reader who was Vietnamese American and came up to me and he said, when I read The Sympathizer, I hear the rhythms of Vietnamese in the English. And I think that's exactly right. I mean, I grew up with both languages. So when I write in English, I'm able to approach it both as an insider and an outsider. And that's both the curse of being colonized, but also the opportunity of being colonized as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Viet.